9 children, 1 missile, and a world that keeps watching. This is not just another headline from Gaza, it's the tragic reality for the al-Najjar family, whose home in Khan Younis was struck, ending the lives of almost all their children in a single, searing instant. The footage of charred remains retrieved from the rubble is the latest entry in a long catalog of horrors, a story told so often that many become numb. But this isn't history, it's happening right now, and it demands more than our attention. It demands answers. How did the world's most scrutinized conflict become a graveyard for civilian hope? And why, with billions in international aid and decades of peace talks, are children still dying in their sleep and hospitals still running dry? Today we're diving deep into the machinery of Gaza's ongoing humanitarian catastrophe, the unrelenting cycle of violence, aid, and systemic failure. As we unpack the tangled roots of this crisis, we'll confront uncomfortable truths about what's really driving Gaza's endless emergency, and why, for all the money and expertise poured in, nothing seems to change. Let's rewind. The modern Gaza Strip is just 41 kilometers long, barely the size of Detroit, yet it sits at the crossroads of world history. In 1948, as the new state of Israel emerged, Gaza became the reluctant home for hundreds of thousands of Palestinian refugees. Over the following decades, this narrow territory experienced seismic shifts in its population, its economy, and its fate. By 1967, Israel had occupied Gaza, further entrenching divisions. In 2005, Israel withdrew its settlements and military, but kept tight control over Gaza's borders, airspace, and coastal waters. A year later, Hamas took power, an event that was quickly followed by a near-total blockade by both Israel and Egypt. Since then, Gaza has lived under siege, a pressure cooker of restricted goods, rising poverty, and shattered infrastructure. Human Rights Watch and the United Nations have repeatedly flagged Gaza as one of the world's worst humanitarian crises. By 2023, unemployment was above 50%. Access to clean water had become a luxury, not a right. The local health system, already under strain, faced repeated shocks as conflict returned again and again. And then there's the violence. In October 2023, the latest war erupted, triggered by deadly attacks, reprisals, and a breakdown in any semblance of trust. The death toll since then? Nearly 54,000, overwhelmingly civilians, including thousands of children. More than 120,000 have been wounded. Just last week, according to Gaza's Civil Defense Agency, at least 15 more people died in new Israeli airstrikes. The numbers are staggering, but the real story is written in the lives lost and futures denied. For most of the world, the humanitarian response has become a weary routine: send aid, issue statements, urge restraint. But on the ground, the situation is only getting worse. Take Khan Younis, the latest epicenter of tragedy. 9 children killed in a single family, their parents among the wounded. Dr. Hamdi al-Najjar survived, but his life and his family are torn apart. As Munir al-Borsh, Gaza's health ministry director, put it, just minutes after returning home, a missile struck their house. This is the reality our medical staff in Gaza endure. Words fall short in describing the pain. Pain that is repeated in home after home, neighborhood after neighborhood. As the world watches, Gaza's hospitals themselves become targets, its doctors and nurses now among the wounded and the dead. But why can't aid solve the crisis, at least enough to let children breathe, eat, or sleep safely? Why, after decades of diplomatic wrangling and billions in donations, does Gaza's suffering only intensify? To answer, we need to understand the machinery, the system that turns aid into an endless loop. First, consider the basic logistics. The Israeli-Egyptian blockade has, since 2007, reduced the movement of goods and people to a trickle. Essential supplies, from food to medicine and fuel, are subject to intense scrutiny and frequent delays. Even during moments of relative calm, UNICEF, the UN's Emergency Children's Fund, finds it nearly impossible to deliver supplies without interference. In times of war, this becomes outright impossible. Then there's the destruction of infrastructure. According to the World Health Organization, by mid-2025, 94% of Gaza's hospitals have been damaged or destroyed. Clean water? Gaza's municipality warns of a citywide crisis, with pipes bombed and repair crews unable to access battered neighborhoods. Food? The UN World Food Program reports that Palestinians now travel 15 miles or more, on foot or in battered cars, just to reach aid points. Sometimes that journey becomes a death march, as looters and aerial strikes make the search for food a gamble with fate. Philippe Lazzarini, the head of UNRWA, the UN's relief agency for Palestinian refugees, was blunt. Israel's proposed aid plan for Gaza will never succeed. When the world's top humanitarian officers are this skeptical, something is profoundly broken. Civilian infrastructure, water, power, medicine, has become a casualty not just of bombs, but of policy. Aid convoys are stopped, searched, sometimes outright blocked. The Gaza Health Ministry's numbers are chilling. In just the past 2 months, nearly 4,000 have died, and over 10,000 have been wounded. Many victims remain trapped under collapsed buildings, unreachable even by the exhausted civil defense teams. The blockade is so tight that even the dead can't always be retrieved. And yet, every major capital on Earth continues to funnel money and pledges toward Gaza, promising that this time will be different. But on the ground, aid is lost, stolen, or arrives too late. The system is meant to save lives, but in practice, it's often just a lifeline for the status quo. They must lift the blockade, urges Francesca Albanese, the UN's special rapporteur, instead of allowing aid to trickle into the war-torn territory. Let's pause and reflect. How did one of the world's most generous flows of aid end up stuck on the wrong side of barbed wire, while families starve? It's not just about money or trucks. It's about the politics of control. Israel maintains that security concerns require strict regulation of every package and every person entering Gaza, warning that unchecked aid could fuel violence. Military spokespeople describe the entire Khan Younis region as a dangerous war zone, justifying access restrictions with the language of self-defense. At the same time, Egypt's own border with Gaza remains tightly sealed, reflecting deep regional anxieties about spillover and instability. The result is a humanitarian labyrinth, where even the world's best intentions get lost. Aid agencies complain of convoluted approval processes, last-minute rerouting, and ever-present threats to staff on the ground. The World Food Programme's spokesman described the desperation. Palestinians are traveling roughly 15.5 miles to reach aid points. But even when aid gets in, order does not always follow. The WFP recently reported that 15 trucks were looted en route to distribution points. The breakdown of civil society under siege creates a vicious cycle. Starvation breeds chaos, chaos breeds more suffering, and all the while, the basic machinery of humanitarian relief grinds to a halt. Expert voices keep sounding the alarm. UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres declared that Palestinians are enduring the cruelest phase of the war, as Israel's blockade creates a medieval siege. Medicine and food are cut off, leaving entire neighborhoods to face hunger and disease. Meanwhile, forensic analysts document vast swaths of neighborhoods flattened, stretching from Rafah in the south to Gaza City in the north, raising devastating questions about whether there will even be a Gaza left to rebuild. The conflict's toxic ripple effects reach even further. Since the war began, there has been a surge in settler attacks on Palestinian villages in the West Bank, inflaming tensions and forcing new waves of displacement. As aid becomes yet another front in the conflict, civilian suffering mounts, and prospects for peace grow more remote. Hope, too, is on the ropes. Egyptian and Qatari mediators have floated a truce lasting up to 7 years, an eternity in Middle East diplomacy, but the fighting continues, and no peace materializes on the horizon. At this point, you might be thinking, isn't there a way out? Doesn't the sheer weight of global attention, the constant stream of diplomats and aid dollars, change anything? It's a question that lingers over every grave and shattered home. As we stand at this crossroads, the humanitarian crisis in Gaza is not only about bombs and politics, it's about the basic failure to protect human dignity. Families like the al-Najjars have become grim symbols of what's at stake. With every child lost, the world's credibility is eroded further. Are we witnessing a temporary tragedy, or the new normal for an entire generation? So what will break the cycle? Can any amount of humanitarian aid, under siege and amid mistrust, truly deliver safety and relief to Gaza's civilians? Or is the entire system, designed to help, now part of the very problem it aims to solve? In the next part, we'll examine the global response, the politics, the failures, and the emerging ideas that could finally change course. Are there any real solutions, or is Gaza destined to remain the world's most intractable humanitarian crisis? As we look ahead, the tragedy in Khan Younis and the relentless suffering in Gaza raise an urgent and unsettling question. What comes next? Can the world really break this cycle, or are we doomed to witness endless repetition of violence, loss, and failed relief? Let's delve into the future, the stakes, and the hard-earned lessons this crisis demands we confront. First, Gaza stands at a crossroads. Experts warn that if current dynamics persist, we could see the crisis deepen. More strikes, more civilian casualties, further decimation of already collapsed infrastructure, and a generation of traumatized children who know only fear and deprivation. According to Francesca Albanese, UN Special Rapporteur, they must lift the blockade completely instead of allowing aid to trickle into the war-torn territory. These are not just words. They are a direct call for a decisive break with the status quo. But let's consider the stark scenarios that could shape Gaza's future. In the worst case, the cycle continues. Every few years, escalation flares into open conflict, outside intervention proves inadequate, and aid shipments are choked by political wrangling. As Philippe Lazzarini, the head of UNRWA, put it, Israel's proposed aid plan for Gaza will never succeed. If international actors fail to apply the lessons from this and past crises, we risk entering a new era of normalized catastrophe, a world where nightly airstrikes and mass displacement are met with weary resignation, hashtags, and little real change. Yet, a persistent chorus of experts and humanitarian leaders say this is not inevitable. There are alternatives, though fraught, that could alter the course. Mediators continue to pursue a long-term ceasefire. Egyptian and Qatari diplomats have put forward proposals for a 7-year truce, and while such plans have fallen short in the past, they reflect a glimmer of hope, however faint. If enough international pressure, paired with bold local leadership, can bring parties to the table, we might see an overdue shift from devastation to dialogue. The most optimistic scenario imagines a comprehensive peace agreement, one that settles issues of borders, refugees, and security for both sides. This would demand compromises and courage beyond what most have shown so far. But history has seen unlikely breakthroughs before. The lesson? Even entrenched conflicts can end, if, and only if, the cost of continuation becomes unforgivably high for those in power. But what about aid, the lifeline that's supposed to save lives yet so often falls short? One hard truth exposed by the latest tragedy is that the international aid system is dangerously inadequate in the face of deliberate obstruction and extreme violence. When aid is blocked, diverted, or only trickles through, it fails its most basic test. Every day, families in Gaza travel impossible distances, sometimes over 15 miles, braving danger for a single meal or bottle of water. The World Food Program reports that some 15 aid trucks were looted just last week, a stark indicator of desperation and breakdown of social order. Meanwhile, the destruction of Gaza's hospitals, 94% damaged according to the World Health Organization, further erodes any last safety net for civilians. In Gaza, it is not only healthcare workers who are targeted. Israel's aggression goes further, wiping out entire families, says Munir Alborsh, health ministry official. When hospitals become battlegrounds and ambulances cannot reach the wounded, humanitarian ideals collapse. Here's a chilling possibility. If this model of restricted, militarized aid is allowed to stand in Gaza, it could become a grim blueprint for future conflicts worldwide. As Philippe Lazzarini warns, current plans seem to be put in place to support a military objective more than a real humanitarian concern. But there is another way. The world's response to Gaza could, if bold enough, spark overdue reform in how the international community approaches conflict zones. What might that look like? First, a non-negotiable respect for humanitarian law. Aid agencies must demand, and the world must enforce, safe, unimpeded access for relief workers and supplies, regardless of military objectives. This isn't idealism. It's the cornerstone of the Geneva Conventions, and failure to uphold it erodes global norms everywhere. Second, the global community must rethink how aid is delivered. Instead of relying on permission from warring factions or occupying powers, agencies can invest in new technologies, drone drops for food and medicine, decentralizing aid depots, and empowering local networks over distant bureaucracies. In the words of Antonio Guterres, UN Secretary General, Palestinians are enduring the cruelest phase of the war. Shortages of food and medicine are not accidental. They are engineered by blockade and neglect. Third, accountability. There must be real consequences, diplomatic, economic, even legal, for states and actors who weaponize starvation, block aid, or target civilians. The idea of no impunity cannot just be a slogan. International courts and sanctions should be used not only as threats, but as real levers for change. And for you, the viewer, what lessons can be drawn from all this, thousands of kilometers away from the immediate suffering? Why should Gaza's fate matter to you personally? Because the failures and successes here set precedents. The way the world responds to Gaza will echo in Yemen, Sudan, Ukraine, and beyond. If the normalization of civilian suffering becomes routine, every crisis risks being met with apathy and impotence. But if enough people refuse to look away, demand accountability, and push their governments to act, change can happen, slowly, against the odds, but unmistakably. On a practical level, your awareness and voice matter. Support can take many forms: donating to credible medical and relief organizations operating in Gaza, amplifying the voices and stories of survivors, and most crucially, holding elected officials accountable for the policies they support or ignore. Small actions ripple outward, often more than we realize. The secret, seldom discussed fact is this: the roots of Gaza's suffering, and so many other crises, lie not just in distant power struggles, but in our collective willingness to accept excuses for inaction. The aid system is not inherently broken. It is weakened when political convenience trumps fundamental human rights. When millions around the world decide their outrage must be matched by action, when aid is treated as a basic obligation, not a bargaining chip, then the cycle can finally begin to break. So after all this pain and complexity, what is the answer to the question posed at the beginning? Can new approaches or the global community finally end Gaza's suffering? Or is the system itself fundamentally flawed? The painful truth is that the aid system cannot succeed in isolation. It is only as effective as the political will underpinning it. Without a fundamental shift, ending blockades, securing real ceasefires, holding violators accountable, no amount of food parcels or bandages can rebuild lives shattered by war. The true flaw is not in logistics, but in the failure to prioritize humanity over geopolitics. Hope, though fragile, persists. Because history shows, when world opinion shifts, when communities and nations decide that enough is enough, even the most entrenched cycles of violence can be pierced by compassion and courage. The future may not be written yet, but with enough pressure, enough empathy, and enough resolve, it can change. If you've watched this far, you're already part of that change. Please, don't let this story fade into background noise. Share this video, talk about what's really happening in Gaza, and let your leaders know the world is watching. For every life lost needlessly, for every child whose story might otherwise be forgotten, let's demand a future where humanitarian aid is not a privilege or a pawn, but a promise kept for all. Thank you for caring, for listening, and for not accepting excuses.